In 2004, Missouri earned the dubious distinction of becoming the first state in the Union to pass an amendment to our state constitution banning same-sex marriage. I grew up in Kentucky, and in Kentucky, even when I was a young guy, our state constitution still had an antiquated provision that banned people from driving motorized vehicles on state roads. Needless to say, that conservative move by voters in the early 20th century in Kentucky did not keep cars off the streets in Kentucky in about the same way that Missouri's absurd amendment will not stop gay people from falling in love with one another. When that amendment was first put on the ballot in Missouri, I organized a press conference and invited area pastors to join me in making a united statement that among the clergy, that this prejudice, this awkward amendment was not a product of religious faith. And I did have several pastors who joined me for the conference, but I was disappointed that they were all retired pastors. I was the only pastor at the press conference who was still drawing a salary from a church. I did, however, receive a few phone calls from other parish pastors who said that they would love to join me. But as one said, I have young children at home. I have to keep a roof over their heads. I cannot afford to be fired. And I don't want to be too diminishing of that response. I was fired not long after that, and I had a kid going into college and a mortgage to pay and lots of years to work before retirement. And I have felt that fear of economic desperation. I know what it's like to be over 50 and unemployed. And let me tell you, when one big church fires you, there's not a dozen others that come looking for you to see if they can hire you. Being fired by people whom you have loved and served, that you've baptized their children, you've buried their parents, you've literally grown up with them for 2 decades is traumatic. It took me a long time to get to the point of being able to say this, but I now believe that being fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. They say that the best way to defend a lion is to unlock the cage. I had no way of appreciating how small my prison had become until I had been set free. Our beautiful and poetic reading from the prophet Isaiah this morning moves quickly from one image to another, like watching a disjointed slideshow. At first, the prophet is reveling in the belief that he's been called to be a teacher, a preacher. And he says, "The Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher, that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning he awakens me through my ears to listen as those who are taught." But then, immediately after saying that, the image changes to a violent image. "I give my back to those who will strike me, my cheeks to those who pull out my beard. I do not hide my face from insult or spitting." On the one hand, the prophet is ebullient about the fact that he's been called to a role of being a professor, a teacher of social justice, a person who proclaims prophetic truth. But he's aware that doing that is going to make people want to beat him on the back, pull out his beard, and spit in his face. And this is what I really want to draw your attention to this morning. This text does not come from first Isaiah, the writer of the first 39 chapters of the book of Isaiah, in which a preacher is in Jerusalem predicting the imminent destruction of the nation. Anybody would get mad at a preacher who was prophesying against his own country. You know, that he's saying, foreign army is going to come, and they're going to wipe us out, they're going to burn down your house, they're going to tear down the walls of the city, and they're going to destroy your temple. Nobody wants to hear that. So you can understand that people rejected that Isaiah. But second Isaiah, the beautiful poetry from the middle of that book, comes from a different preacher from an entirely different generation, 50 years later. He isn't warning an established nation that they're about to be conquered and carried away into slavery. That's not what's making people mad. The second Isaiah is preaching to a ghetto full of slaves who have been in slavery for so long that they don't even know anyone around there who had been alive before they were taken into slavery. And he is telling them, your cage is open. You don't have to be slaves anymore. That they are now being legally allowed to leave their familiar enslavement in Persia and return to their own land, to rebuild their own nation, to observe their own religion, eat their own kind of food, keep their culture. But apparently a lot of slaves in the ghetto responded by throwing rocks at him and spitting in his face and pulling out his beard. Now that's weird. He's announcing their liberation, and they didn't want to be liberated. The famous abolitionist Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery when she was young, but she returned to the South many times as an organizer of the Underground Railroad. And late in her life, she said, I freed thousands of slaves, but I could have freed thousands more if I could have convinced them that they were slaves. From the days of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and the Greek gods of Olympus, governments have used religion to keep society stable. As such, most houses of worship are defenders of the status quo. We fought World War II not by giving tax cuts to the wealthy, but by selling war bonds to everyone. And do you know who sold the most war bonds in the United States leading up to World War II? The United Methodist Church. That's what that opening exercise, those of you that are old enough that you went to an opening exercise before Sunday school where you said a pledge of allegiance to the American flag and the Christian flag and sang Onward Christian Soldiers, that tradition of that opening exercise was where you sold war bonds. That's what that came from. The church has been an institution that supported the government and the status quo. Now, ironically, all the world's religions began in a protest against the status quo and typically a protest against the government and advocacy of the poor. The prophetic tradition has always stood up to challenge the status quo, but the institutional church, synagogue, temple, house of prayer, the institutional priest and preacher and imam tells people that we've always supported the wars that our government throws at us. Who do we need to kill this year? We've always hated gay people. That's our religious tradition. We've always bowed down to the power of the employer or the slave owner. And you must believe in the same magic that the rest of us believe in order to participate in this status quo. Keeping people believing and repeating the same anti-intellectual, anti-critical thinking religion is part of keeping them from ever questioning authority, ever questioning the social order. Once you can make someone believe something that is totally absurd, then you can get them to do almost anything, from strapping on a suicide bomber vest to telling your own son or daughter to get out of the house because they're gay. No sane person would do either one of those things. But if you can get someone to believe enough crazy stuff in religion, then they will do something that is absolutely nuts. Once you question ancient religious assertions that tell you that you are so sinful that God had to kill himself, that even because life is unfair, unjust, and cruel in this world that God made, we know of a secret world that God also made, where either you will be infinitely tortured for all eternity, or you will enjoy incomprehensible wealth and comfort. Now, of course, the God who created all three of those could have just made the cushy world and we could have all started out there. But somehow in this system, we appreciate that world more if we get messed over for a few decades in this life. There's some other stuff, about a preacher in a fish's belly and walking on water and stuff. But basically, the sum total of it is you're supposed to believe whatever the guy wearing the big black dress says to you. Just go along. Just nod your heads. I was in graduate school more than 30 years ago, and even then, some of my biblical professors, would occasionally introduce a lecture by saying, now you guys can't say this in your churches. You can't say this in church. But assuming that if we took good scholarship into the parish, the stupid people that went to church would fire us. Well, okay, they will, but it's another story. But because of that, that is why most churches in modern America hold on to a 17th century way of talking when they are inside their church. But then those people have to walk out the church door and try to live in the 21st century. And so is it any surprise that you can get some people who will look right into the television camera and tell you that global warming isn't happening because they don't believe in it. You know, I don't believe in it, so it's not true. They can say that the United States has the best health care in the world, even though statistically, factually, we're somewhere around 35th in the world, but because I choose not to believe it. You know, once you get someone to say, I believe this crazy thing, this thing that can't be supported, this thing that can't be proven, then there's no stopping it. Even C.S. Lewis, one of the darlings of the evangelical church, said that a madman cannot put out the light of the sun by writing the word darkness on his cell wall. And yet traditional religion expects you to do basically that. Assuming that you can recite a creed, that you make it true because a bunch of other people recite it in unison with you. Give me someone who actually believes that the doctrine of the Trinity accurately describes the nature of the one true God, and trust me, you're talking to someone who can be made to believe that you can cut taxes and balance the federal budget at the same time. Because if you can believe that Trinity stuff, you can even believe that math doesn't work anymore. Those of you who are on my email list have seen many of the letters from viewers that we have from around the world who often write saying that they have never heard anything like what they get from my sermons on YouTube or iTunes. That they didn't know that you could be a Christian that is free of superstition and magic, that you can still be devoted to the ethical teachings of Jesus without believing in blood sacrifice or the threat of burning in hell or some alternative of living in a mansion on streets of gold with dozens of virgins. And I've never understood, if they're going to stay virgins, what's the deal? But here's a news flash for you. There is nothing that you have heard me say that is original to me. Not a thing. I am not an original scholar in any way. The only thing that is different about me is I'm not afraid anymore. If there's anything unusual about the content of our church's sermons, YouTube channel, or iTunes stuff, it's because I simply quit paying attention to when the professor said, you can't say this in church. John Shelby Spong says that the fastest growing church in America is the Church Alumni Association, because people are not going to go on forever being willing to assassinate their brains and believe stuff that is clearly not true and stuff that leads to oppression and violence and discrimination and inequity and wars and divisions within families. People aren't going to keep buying that product. And let me just add this. As much as I love the work of the Jesus Seminar scholars, Bob Funk, John Spong, John Dominic Crossan, Karen Armstrong, Marcus Borg, there's really not much original work in their books either. The Jesus Seminar came into existence in order to make existing scholarship popular. And those authors that I named are good writers. They've written books in order to popularize Jesus scholarship that's been going on for 2 centuries. I think they've often said it better than their academic predecessors, but it's not really new information. Progressive Christianity isn't a new kind of Christianity. It's the Christianity of Thomas Jefferson and Søren Kierkegaard. This is the faith of Jewish and Christian and Muslim and Buddhist scholars for the last 2 centuries. It feels like we're plowing new ground, but we're really just wiping the sleep out of our eyes and taking possession of our own academic heritage to discover a way of being people of faith who live in a real world rather than an imaginary world. And so I believe the only church that will survive, the only one that should survive, is the one that joins Isaiah in courageously telling the truth, even if it makes people mad, even if they would prefer to remain in mental slavery, even if they prefer the cage to freedom. We've already freed thousands from the grips of irrational fear, guilt, and superstition. And there are thousands more that we could free if they're just willing to stop being enslaved to ignorance and fear. To those who are willing to unplug from the matrix of illusion and lies, welcome to reality. It isn't all that pretty, but I can tell you this: if you still want to go to heaven, you're going to have to roll up your sleeves and join us in the trenches, because most of any heaven you're ever going to see is the heaven that we build together by ending poverty, by stopping wars, by putting an end to discrimination, and by bringing justice to those who have been the victims of an unjust and inequitable society. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.